Hello, college fantasy football family and friends. You're watching, listening to the CFF Sites Week 11 podcast. My name is Joe DeSalvo. I'm your host, as usual, and it's here. I called this weeks 11, 12, 13. They're the money weeks, guys, and why? Because this is it. This is where the money's won in your fantasy league. Some of you guys are wrapping up your regular seasons this week 11, carrying week 12 and 13 as your semifinal and final week of the playoffs. There are many of you guys that have concluded your regular season already, and you're starting the first week of the playoffs, some of the bigger leagues where you need 3 rounds. So the playoffs are here for some of you guys. Playoffs are right around the corner for some of you guys. And for those that haven't started yet, it really is a playoff week because you're either playing for seedings right now or you're playing for a spot to get into the postseason. And then, for you guys that play in cumulative point totals leagues, you're coming up to the end as well. And you've only got 3 weeks left. So it makes college fantasy football so unique. A lot of different formats out there, and there are a lot more out there with different formats that I just don't have time to get into. But, based on the emails that come in, overwhelmingly, all of the leagues, most of the leagues are head-to-head leagues, 2 to 3 week playoffs. And so the time is now. We're going to do a little bit differently instead of going into individual matchups, because I feel like there's so much to cover this week. So many injuries across the board. You guys are really going to have to pay attention to a lot of the game day news, a lot of big starters, big name starters that are going to be questionable this week going into the weekend. And so I'm recording this as usual late on a Wednesday evening. And as I record this, there's 3 MAC games going on right now. So the MAC schedule will be complete already this week. And I'm gonna comment in regards to the scheduling, some recommendations on how to play things from here on out to close out your season. And I really, if I'd have thought about this last week, I would have mentioned it. But the injuries that have kind of hit you guys across the board, it's done 2 things. It's for many of you guys, it's kind of put you on upset alert now. You've got some injuries to some big players. You're going into the playoffs, maybe the final week, needing a win, and you've got to kind of, your depth is going to be tested this week. And for others that are sitting there knocking on the door, it's kind of giving you guys an opportunity where some of the better teams in the league have had some injuries as well. So it works both ways. I mean, the great thing here with the site is that I get emails from you guys all across the board. There are some that there are some that's been eliminated. There are some that are sitting at the top of the league. And, much like I mentioned last week, you guys cover the spectrum. There's some sitting there right now in the heart of a playoff race and scraping to get in. So we're going to go over this week on the show. We're going to go into some things that I've noticed in regards to league setup. I'm hoping to kind of throw some things out this week that will give you all some things to think about going into next year. I usually do it around this time of the year every year on the way that you set up your league, maybe set up your scheduling, just some recommendations as well on what could be coming down, maybe some enhancements over at Fantrax as well, which could be on the horizon for the 2022 season. And then we're going to get into the scheduling as well. We're going to kind of give a brief overview of some of the conference matchups and some of the things that I'm going to look out for instead of going down every single game. This particular time of the season, a lot of you guys are the most of the rosters are set at this point, and it's just kind of picking out the right matchups depending on how deep your roster is. Before we get knee deep into everything, and I know we're recording here in week 11, and I just want to say on behalf of Mike and myself, thank you guys again for another great year, a very interactive year, and in some ways very challenging year. I know Mike and I, juggled quite a bit this year with kind of getting the new format of the rankings. Projections certainly kept me busy. These midweek games have certainly crammed our schedule up. As a matter of fact, I've probably got the projections going up a little later, maybe as late as I've posted them, maybe in 4 or 5 weeks now, because they won't be really done until Thursday. These midweek games just catch up with us, and we're kind of crunching it around the clock 7 days a week for you guys, turning out as much content as we can. Mike's done a tremendous job with the DFS write-ups. And so really on behalf of Mike and myself, before you guys start bowing out for the season as you get eliminated in your playoffs, thank you for another year of support. And then also, stay in touch with the site. Keep, if you have a chance, if you want to get into another league, I mentioned this on last week's show. I'm looking at getting some of the bowl season fantasy leagues up again. And I'm going to put that out there for the users, particularly a lot of you guys that are in there on the Discord, in the league recruitment channel. We're going to try to get a bunch of bowl leagues going. Last year we didn't do it, I think, because of the COVID situation. But the year before that, I think I had as many as 12. And one year I hosted as many as 15 leagues. So we'll produce a bowl season fantasy guide for that as well, which will include rankings, the projections. Mike will do his DFS write-ups as well. And, we've got some more stuff coming for you guys. It's a second chance at another college fantasy football league. It's rather condensed. It will be a 4 or 5 week season, however the bowl season lasts. But for you guys that are college fantasy football diehards like we are, it's a chance to kind of get another season under your belt and really just play college fantasy football for another 4 or 5 weeks. It's a great time to do it over the holiday season, into the new year. And like I mentioned, it just really shortens the off season for us and gives us some more college fantasy football engagement. So more details to come in regards to the college fantasy football bowl season leagues in the coming weeks, particularly as the regular season comes to a close and we hit that dead period between week 13 and the bowl season. We've got the conference championship weeks. We'll probably do some write-ups and the projections for those weeks, but then we've got a couple of weeks where we'll start getting that content ready and try to create those leagues for you guys. So more to come there. Stay in touch, that's for sure. So before we get into the matchups, the one thing that I really want to mention, and these are merely suggestions moving forward, right? As I think of all of the emails that come in during the season, guys scratching, clawing, working their way through the standings, maybe had a slow start. The one thing that I want to throw out there in regards to league format, I know. And really, this is for a lot of you guys that play in head-to-head formats with single matchups every single week. I see this and I get the emails every year, this time of year, where there's just guys that are still in contention. They don't think that they have a shot because they're playing one of the worst teams in the league who have not kept up with their teams. And it just looks like no matter if they win out the guy that they're playing, it looks like a guaranteed win because they're starting guys, 2 or 3 guys that really are injured and been on bye weeks. And there's nothing you could really do. It's part of the integrity of the league. You hope to get owners that will stay engaged throughout the entire 13 weeks, but ultimately it's their money and they can do what they want with it. And if they want to donate to the pot, then donate to the pot, right? But some suggestions or a suggestion or two that I'd like to make going in for some of you guys that run into these situations. And this is a drum that I've beaten a lot over the last several years. I know with my league, we like to play double headers and triple headers. I love head-to-head leagues that have multiple matchups in it. I'm not a fan of head-to-head leagues with single matchups. Because what happens is in those single matchup leagues, like I mentioned, you get teams that are they don't become engaged at the end of the year. So what happens is you may play a team over the first month of the season and those owners are super charged up. It's a new season. They're super engaged. They'll beat some teams. And then all of a sudden halfway through the year, they lose a little bit engagement or they slip up over 2 or 3 weeks and then they lose a little interest. Week 9 on the schedule, week 10 gets here and they're like, oh, I'm 5 games out. I'm not going to make the playoffs. And then they don't keep up with their teams. And so when you incorporate multiple matchups into your league, double headers and triple headers, it gives the league a little bit of that integrity back at the end of the year, because there's a good chance that some of the matchups or a lot of the matchups are then going to be meaningful. Just make a schedule where everybody plays one another twice, or everybody plays one another 3 times. And what happens is, remember, this is college fantasy football. There's nothing worse than scoring the second most points in the league and getting a loss. I never thought that was really fair, considering this is college fantasy football. It's not real football, right? And there's some of you out there that say, hey, look, that's the breaks. And then I also feel that, you could look at it the other way too. I don't think that it's right that a team that scores the second lowest amount of points for the week gets a win because they happen to play the lowest scoring team of the week. So the law of averages work themselves out when you play multiple matchups. And what happens is the cream eventually rises to the top, and the guys that have kept up with their team for the majority of the year and have made good moves all at the same time, which is what you want in your leagues. Engagement, and you want guys to be, guys that know what they're doing. Those are the guys that ultimately get rewarded when you have, when you schedule multiple matchups into your league. So that was just a suggestion based on a lot of the emails that I come in. I know a lot of you guys are kind of sitting in that boat right now where you've lost. I can think of at least 3 or 4 examples of guys that have emailed me that have probably lost games by single digits 2 or 3 times this year. I know one guy that looks like he's not even going to make the playoffs, and he's the top scoring team in his league. And I just think, look, there's some one-offs, yeah, but I think on the whole, it's college fantasy football. It's about scoring points. It's about rewarding the best rosters, the best team, let those teams advance into the playoffs, and that's the way it should play out. Now, another scenario as well, if you want to play the record thing too, is particularly if you want to play single matchups, another great idea too, and a lot of leagues do incorporate this, is if you're going to qualify 4 teams at the end of the year and have a semifinal and final playoff system, or if you're going to have a quarterfinal system with a 3-week setup, then maybe in the semifinal setup, you reward the 3 teams with the best records, and then take the next best team with the most total points over the course of the season. And that way record is irrelevant, right? Or if you do the 8-team playoff, maybe you do the top 6 teams with the best records, and then take the next 2 highest scoring teams and reward the teams that have kept up and have really, played it right. Maybe they didn't catch a break here or there. And so those are just some suggestions that I like to incorporate in my leagues, because ultimately I think the purpose of the college fantasy football league is to have one of the best rosters in the league. And the way that the schedule lays out, particularly if you play in full FBS formats, is, you've got to survive the non-conference schedule at the beginning of the year, particularly if you've got a lot of the G5 players. And then sometimes you guys make a run late that are, predominantly G5 players. There's a lot of different formats that people play, and there's a way to strategy. That's part of the draft strategy as well. But I'm looking and throwing out ideas and suggestions for a lot of you guys for your leagues, because look, for as long as some of us have been doing this, and yes, of course, I've been around for a long time in college fantasy football, there are others that we get new guys in, new owners in every year in college fantasy football, which is what we love. And so I just want to really throw out some ideas and suggestions for a lot of you guys that are creating new leagues, and you're always looking for ways to improve your league, or, improve the integrity of the league, particularly at the end of the year. So you're not stuck with a bunch of idle teams and, giving basically some teams some easy wins. Throw in the multiple matchups, make it, incentivize teams with the most scoring points irrelevant, take record off the board, and maybe you reserve a spot or 2 for the highest scoring teams in the league. I just think that there's some ways to really just kind of get the integrity of the league intact, to keep the integrity of the league intact throughout the entire season, so you guys don't lose that at the end of the year. So really, that's sort of some suggestions moving forward for you guys for next year, because much like, Mike and I have to do, soon when this season's over, we'll kind of hit the board and start pinning up some ideas and suggestions for next year. During the season's not the time to do that. We like to do those things early. And, I'll even throw that out to you guys. If there's anything that you see that you'd like to, us to make a change, any suggestions, send them in to me. We're open. Mike and I are definitely open to feedback. We're looking to ways to really improve the site, maybe add some features next year. Everything's on the board, and he and I will be definitely sitting down in December and January and kind of throwing some ideas up on the board, and everything that you guys offer will, I promise you, we'll get, we will take it seriously, and we will give it some thought. And if there's anything that we can do to incorporate some ideas that you guys have, we'll definitely take a look at that. But moving on to the next topic, and I opened up with this because there are a lot of injuries going on this week. And so this is a real simple strategy that usually that comes into play this time of year. As I mentioned, it didn't seem like the injury bug was that big of a concern until this past week, when there's a bunch of names that are dinged up going into these final weeks. But we have these midweek games with these MAC teams going on right now. And there were a lot of emails coming in looking for some, just a second opinion or a little bit of insight, because usually Mike and I like asked to hold off on a lot of the questions until the projections are posted. But because of these Wednesday games, you've got to make some decisions early in the week. And I get that. We completely get it. So, we take a little time more than usual on a Monday and Tuesday to kind of walk through some of the scenarios with you guys to give you a little insight. So hopefully you guys can make the decisions that you need for your roster options, your roster builds for the week. And the one piece of advice that I can give you on weeks like this week and last, and the weeks coming up where you have a lot of midweek matchups and you have injuries across the board, is that you really need to give serious consideration to starting some of these midweek guys, particularly in matchups where, the projected totals are up there. You've got a productive guy. Maybe you're splitting hairs between him. Maybe, but if the projections come out early, maybe you've got a guy going on Wednesday who is projected for a couple of points lower than someone that's playing on a Saturday. But that guy on Saturday, maybe he was dinged up the week before. I think you've always got to err on the side of caution, particularly this time of the year. I think you have to take sometimes the safer route. And sometimes the safer route is taking the guaranteed start, because you don't want to hold the guy off on starting him because you have a player, and I'm going to use maybe like a Jerome Ford this week, who didn't play in the second half last week. And so now we're going into a matchup this week. I think Cincinnati plays South Florida, and now a lot of his owners are wondering whether or not he's going to be available this week. Well, if you've got a player like Bryant Koback, you got a player like Lou Nichols, you're three deep and you got to start two running backs. You want to err on the side of caution and play the guys that are going to be guaranteed starts that are going to be in there. And the last thing you want to do is hold out hope that Jerome Ford's going to end up starting for Cincinnati. He doesn't start, and then you've left a quality starter on your bench that had a really good matchup. And so those are the things that you guys have to consider as we get into these playoff weeks, because you can live with a guy maybe underperforming a little bit and losing by 4 or 5 points that way. I can live with that. It's a bitter pill to swallow sometimes, but I can live with that more than I can live by losing by 12 points and leaving a guy on the bench and getting a goose egg because he didn't start at all. I think those are the decisions that you end up regretting more than the other ones, because at least you spend all season up until this point, you have spent 10 weeks building that roster depth. I say it almost on every podcast every week. The waiver wire is about building roster depth this time of the year. And the reason why you want to do that is for exactly the scenarios that are playing out right now, that are unfolding in week 11, where you have these injuries across the board. Now is the time to take advantage of that depth that you have to make sure that you don't get a goose egg. And that's the one thing that you have to avoid more than any other during playoff weeks, or when you're facing elimination or in a do or die situation to move up the standings, is you can't take goose eggs. You can't. It's the one thing that I say every single year. You've got to play the guaranteed starter, even if it means maybe not getting as many as projected points, because the alternative is you end up with a 0 and then you lose that way. And then you regret sitting the guy that was absolutely healthy and you held out hope for the end of the week. Now, how do you get around some of those? How can we get around some of those decisions? Well, one is, if you don't have any midweek guys, and maybe maybe you load up on the waiver wire this week or next week on guys that have late start dates, right? Maybe you pick up, maybe there's a couple of guys on the waiver wire. You have a player that's injured, and a lot of questions come in about, hey, who do you prefer on the waiver wire for the rest of the year? Well, you know what, player A versus, it's not as simple as player A versus player B. I say this every week for a lot of questions that come in, and I say it a lot on the podcast. So many of these questions that you guys send in, you have to consider the context around the question. And when you're sending in an email about whether I should consider player A or player B, well, also keep in mind the thing that you have to think about, the thing that I don't know when I see these emails as well, is who's on your roster. Do you have a player that's hurt? Because the way that I'm approaching this is, if I've got a guy, and I'll just throw out a scenario here, right? Let's say I've got Rashad White over at Arizona State, and I know that there's a chance that he may not play, or that he's banged up in a late game on the West Coast. What I may do is, when it comes to the waiver wire, I may look to pick up the guy, all things considered equal, that's got to start a late date. Because if you have a league that doesn't lock rosters or a player spot up until 5 minutes before kickoff or until kickoff, you want to take advantage of the time window that you have on a Saturday to get as much injury information as you can before kickoff. So my suggestion is, in those type of scenarios as well, if you've got some banged up players and you're looking at the waiver wire to build some depth, maybe you pick up a player from the same team as him and handcuff him, and maybe you risk just throwing a guy out on the waiver wire that's pretty good. But you cannot take zeros this time of the year, and you've really got to evaluate who the player is, when he's going to be playing in the upcoming week. And when you're making waiver moves, you've got to consider all of that, because you've got to be able to make swaps at the deadline to get certain guys in, because that's just the way college fantasy football works. That's the way college football works. We don't get a really good grasp of injury information until that news starts hitting at Twitter, and some of these beat writers are on site and they say that a guy's warming up, or the guy's suited up, he's going through, warm-ups. And even then, it's not even a guarantee that he's going to play, as we've seen a number of times this year. So these are a lot of scenarios that are playing out that have played out last week, that are playing out this week, that will continue to play out throughout the playoffs, that I'm trying to make you guys aware of now, and really a benefit for you guys that are listening to the podcast or watching the YouTube show, because these are questions that come in every week. And I know not everybody watches and listens to these shows, but these are the things that you guys have to think about this time of the year, particularly if you want to put yourself in a position to win money. Sure, sometimes things just go your way. It's a perfect storm, and you've caught every break, and you don't end up anyone on the injury list. You've got a full roster to work with, but it only takes one time for that to happen to you, and you're going to be like, damn, I wish I'd have thought of that. And so, look, I don't know everything, but I see a lot of emails coming in every week, and I'm trying to give you guys the scenarios that play out over the emails to put you all in someone else's shoes. So when you're faced with that situation, you have the idea in your head of how you want to roll with it. So give that some thought. And so that's my strategy. Now, the good thing is, and I could say this as well, and I'll start to get the ball rolling on this, is that I've had some discussions with some of the the guys over at Fantrax, my contact over at Fantrax this year. I'm not ready to say that it's definitely a guarantee, but they are looking at, and I'm feeling very optimistic about a 0-player substitution rule next year that may come in effect, that they're going to build into the platform. So it will help alleviate some of the anxiety around injuries for college fantasy football, that if a player doesn't play or possibly gets 0 points, then there might be an automatic substitution where you have to prioritize your bench players. And so I don't want to oversell that right now, but I throw it out there because there's some headway that's being made in that area right now. And I feel very optimistic that Fantrax is going to work that into the platform next year. I've had some good conversations with them, and I'm fighting for it because that's something that I feel is needed in college fantasy football. And so I'll keep you guys updated as we get more information on that. But I feel very optimistic that we're going to have that feature for 2022. So with that being said, guys, let's get into the week 11 matchups. And of course, we know that we do not have one conference to worry about this week because the MAC is already playing and they've already, they've played on Tuesday. I'm recording this on Wednesday. By the time I'm finished getting this up, those games will have already played out. So what we'll do is we'll just go conference by conference, and I'll try to take it maybe G5 this week, and then we'll end up with the Power 5 conferences. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of glance over the matchups real quick. Not going to go game by game. I'm going to start off in the American Conference. And of course, I think the big question, like I mentioned, with the injuries in the show, what's the deal with Jerome Ford? What I read last week was that he was banged up at halftime. Coach Fickle thought he might give it a go in the second half. Didn't feel confident in the injury. I don't know what the injury is. I don't know what degree and how severe the injury is. The only thing that I do know is that Cincinnati plays a day earlier. They play on Friday. That's 24 hours of heel time that's lost for Jerome Ford in a matchup where they likely won't need him. And I think if you have Jerome Ford, you have to have on. You certainly have to be on standby this week. When I look at the other games over in the American Conference, none of the other games really stick out at me. I think the only other roster decision that you may have to make might be in regards to Memphis running back, whether or not Brandon Thomas is going to get a go against East Carolina. I think that's one that you have to kind of get an update on as well. So those are really the two matchups, the two players that really stick out for me in that conference that I think are probably on a lot of fantasy rosters that you're going to need some type of game day update. The good thing is Cincinnati plays at 5:00 on Friday. And so the good news is usually when you're on a game that's broadcast around the country and it's one of the only games on that night, we usually get, some good injury tidbits or some good updates before the game on whether or not a player is going to actually take the field. And so I feel optimistic we'll get an update on Jerome Ford, but I think you have to make plans. You have to plan it out as if he may not be available for you Friday night. So have a contingency plan. And then same thing with Brandon Thomas at an 11 a.m. game on Saturday against East Carolina, which is a good matchup, but you have to wonder whether or not he's going to be back this week because there seemed to be a little bit of uncertainty around the timeline in which he was going to be out. And so I'm not optimistic about him either. I think those are really the only two that stand out for me. I think the only other thing that I would mention as well is over at SMU. I still get a few questions coming in about Ulysses Bentley, and obviously my recommendations are if you've got Ulysses Bentley on in a redraft league, I don't know why you still have him at this point, because at this stage of the season, it looks like Trey Siggers is definitely the top option in that backfield. And I think you guys are really only debating that for keeper league purposes. And so I just want to throw that out there once again. So we move over from the American Conference. Let's go into Conference USA. When I look at these matchups, what sticks out at me, obviously Middle Tennessee State, there was a change there at quarterback. Whether or not whether or not UAB's defense is going to be able to do anything to kind of tame the Marshall offense a little bit remains to be seen. I still have a lot of confidence in Rasheen Ali this week at running back at home. It's nice to see that Dwayne McBride, the running back for UAB, is getting some run. And I think given the Marshall run defense and how porous they've been this year, I think you've got to get him in the lineup as well. Old Dominion has been a nice, pleasant surprise for some fantasy options there with Watson and Kuntz as well. And then UTSA shouldn't have any problems with Southern Miss. And then obviously you've got UTEP, North Texas. And I've mentioned it and warned it for weeks now on what's going on with UTEP running back. I'm still not sold there as well. And so nothing's really sticking out to me in regards to player news in that conference. When I look at the list of players that I wrote down, I think there might be some news around Victor Tucker for Charlotte, which is interesting because they've got that matchup against Louisiana Tech. He might be the guy that you want to certainly pay attention to. I think Austin Kendall got hurt, or maybe he was replaced, but I think he got hurt, and maybe JD Head came in there for Louisiana Tech. Given that matchup, that could be some type of an emergency starter if you need someone at the quarterback spot. Just to kind of throw those names out there for you guys to be a little bit of alert on that. Over I'll go ahead and cover. Let's see, before we get into the independents, let's go ahead. Let's see. I mentioned the MAC. Let's go into the Mountain West Conference. Let's take a look there. Wyoming at Boise State. Careful with Xavier Valladay right there. Charles Williams at UNLV. Obviously, he's been a solid start. I thought he'd be a little bit more of a matchup start this year, but he's been very solid and very consistent this year. That David Bailey matchup against Air Force could be a little dicey. Curious to see how that one shakes out. Here's one that jumps out at me. A lot of you down on Fresno State, and I have been over the last couple of weeks. And here's something that I'll mention in regards to Jalen Cropper. When I look at Fresno's schedule, let's look at this. Right, they were healthy at the beginning of the year, right? So we know they pushed Oregon to the limit, lost by 7. They ran through Connecticut, Cal Poly. They won that game at UCLA. Then they get UNLV. They play Hawaii, and then they lose that game at Hawaii. And they didn't look great at all. They really, from that particular point on, have not looked great. But they did play at Wyoming. They played Nevada, which they scored 32 points. But then they played San Diego State and Boise State, 2 teams that kind of gave them trouble, that had some decent defenses. As we get into this matchup this week against New Mexico, I did have an email or two, a little bit hesitation on Jalen Cropper this week because of the way the Fresno State offense has looked over the past couple of weeks, maybe the past 3 or 4 weeks. I think this is the week you definitely get Cropper in. I see a bounce back week for that I see a bounce back game for that Fresno offense. And I do think that this could be one of those big games for Jalen Cropper. There's no way that I'm going into this matchup with what Cropper has done up until this point and sitting him against New Mexico. Utah State, Logan Bonner was a big play for us last week in the projections, a little bit of a hesitation this week, but that San Jose State offense, it just looks different with Nick Starkel, and I think it opens things up and opens running lanes for Tyler Nevins, and I think now he's into the equation a little bit more than when Nick Nash was the starter there. I wasn't impressed with the running game at all, even though Nash had gone for 100 yards a couple of games in a row. But with Nick Starkel in there, it opens up the passing game, opens up the field, and opens up some running lanes for Nevins. And so I do think that he's an option as well. Now, when you get to the matchup, Nevada at San Diego State, that's the one that's the one that really jumps out at me this week because, this is a game at San Diego State. I mentioned when Fresno State played San Diego State a couple of weeks ago or a week or two ago. So was it last week? I was like, it was a couple of weeks ago. I was like, San Diego State hadn't seen an offense like Fresno State's. And so Fresno State won that game. And so I say the same thing. This is going to be, San Diego State now has seen Fresno. They saw, they got Hawaii, and now they're getting Nevada. Maybe this is a little bit now at home where they can slow this Nevada offense. And remember, and here's what you've got to keep in mind. You've got a tight end like Cole Turner who left the game last week going through concussion protocol. He's the one you've got to keep an eye on as well. Maybe this Nevada team doesn't have Cole Turner going into the matchup. But like I've said all along, I've said this a number of times this season, even though I don't wish concussions on anyone, it's the best injury for your player to have on your roster than any other injury that they can get, because usually when they're clear of a concussion, they're full go. So they can start. There's no bummed ankle. There's no bummed shoulder. There's no bum leg. It's a head situation. So they're either cleared at 100% or they're not cleared at all. And so if Cole Turner suits up and it looks like he's going through warmups, then he's a go. There's going to be really no suiting up and not playing, but he's the guy you've got to be careful of. And that's the matchup you've got to be careful of in the Mountain West Conference if you're loaded with some Nevada players. Let's go on into the Sun Belt Conference since we already covered, since the MAC has played. We're going to go into the Sun Belt Conference. Coastal Carolina, curious to see what happens there. Obviously, we've got Grayson McCall that looks like he's going to be shelved for a little bit. Wouldn't even surprise me if he's out for the rest of the regular season. Bryce Carpenter is going to take over there. Reese White missed game time last week. Dicey situation if you're going to take a chance with him this week. Shamari Jones probably the safer play. And that's raised a little doubt about Javon Hiley as well and Isaiah Likely on whether or not they're going to have to throw the ball a good bit against Georgia State and whether or not those guys can put up some numbers as if McCall was the quarterback. Curious to see how that plays out. And I'm curious to see how the projections shake out on that as well. South Alabama going to Appalachian State, and Jake Bentley got dinged up last week. I think he's a question, injury concern going into this week as well in that matchup at Appalachian State. So that's something that you guys have to keep an eye on because that's obviously going to affect Jalen Tolbert for Southern Miss. And so Jalen Tolbert, a wide receiver for South Alabama. And so that obviously could have a factor in that matchup on the road against that Appalachian State defense. Louisiana going on the road to Troy. Louisiana is one of those teams that are just really hard to figure out with that running game right now. You've got Chris Smith, Montrell Johnson, the 1-2 punch, but there hasn't been a lot of consistency this year. And now they're going into Troy. And I think this could be a tricky game for the Raging Cajuns if their offense and the consistency in which they've been, they haven't been consistent. And if there's no consistency right there, this could be a tricky matchup for them. And then for you guys that have been holding on to Arkansas State players, it's nice to see them get a nice matchup this week. And so that brings your Arkansas State players back in the fold in that matchup against Louisiana Monroe this week. Now, I think we covered everything in regards to the group of five conferences. So let's go ahead and get into P5. Let's go Atlantic Coast. Let's go A through Z. North Carolina playing at Pitt. Every game right now with those teams are turning into a fantasy dream. Pitt, Wake Forest, North Carolina. The ACC has been golden for fantasy points this week. And who'd have thunk it? Not even Clemson, but we get a treat this week as Clemson hosts Connecticut. So they shouldn't have any problems whatsoever hosting the Huskies. Curious to see how DJU does at quarterback. You guys holding on to Will Shipley out there. This could be a nice spot for him as well. I think this is a game that even though Clemson has struggled up until this point this year, I think they're just going to completely overwhelm Connecticut and see if this one gets out of hand early. You've got Shipley, you've got Maffa. Kind of curious, Kobe Pace in there as well. Kind of curious to see how the carries get split up if that game gets a little ugly. Syracuse, Louisville. You've got to like both of the running quarterbacks in that situation, as well as Sean Tucker over at running back. Tyler Van Dyke for Miami has been spectacular. Curious to see if he hits a bump in the road in that road matchup in against Florida State. I don't know if I see it happening, but maybe he does have a hiccup somewhere. Duke, a lot of questions coming in with Mateo Durant, right? I haven't made any suggestions to drop Durant. I think Durant is one of those players that he does really well if you don't want to start him. That adds quality depth to your roster. I think I mentioned this last week, but I've certainly mentioned it on a bunch of emails that have come in. Durant for me is a hold. Even though Duke is having trouble scoring as of late, you're not going to find many 100-yard running backs on the waiver wire that has a chance to do it week in and week out. I know he's gone for 100 yards, I think at least 6 times this year, maybe 6 in 9 games or 7 in 9. You're not going to find that type of 100-yard potential on the waiver wire. And in a pinch, if I've got to start a guy that's got 100-yard potential, I'll take that and hope, and I'll roll the dice that Duke can find the end zone, and Durant's the guy that's going to find it for them because he's such a big part of that running game. So there's no way that I'm dropping Mateo Durant at this stage of the season. He's a quality running back that you want to have on the back end of your roster to give you a little flexibility if you run into an injury or a bye week situation for sure. Obviously that matchup for Notre Dame on the road at Virginia. What's going to go on with Brennan Armstrong? I know a lot of you guys, at this particular point in the season, Brennan Armstrong, has been, if not the top fantasy quarterback, certainly one of the top 2 fantasy quarterbacks in all of college football this year. So for you guys to go into this matchup without Armstrong, you're really got to, make some adjustments and really roll the dice with a matchup this week. I'm optimistic that he's going to give it a go. I'm optimistic that he's going to play. I saw an interview that he did. Fortunately, he had a week to rest up. There was a bye week. He's a tough kid. And I can see him actually playing in this game, and I can see him playing well. I just wouldn't expect to see him really do much in regards to mobility. I think that's the one thing you have to worry about. And it's the one thing that makes me nervous about playing Notre Dame is that it isn't that Notre Dame's defense has been as good as they have been in years past, but Notre Dame is physical, and that offensive line isn't great in front of Armstrong. And you've got to hope that they hold up or he can get rid of the ball so he just doesn't take any shots if he does play. I'm optimistic that he's going to go. For you guys that, if we find out, here's one of those situations. It's going to be a nationally televised game on ABC, which is great. We're going to get a lot of news, particularly up until kickoff, but it's a 6:30 kickoff on a Saturday. It's not an 11 a.m. kickoff. So if you're holding out hope that Brennan Armstrong is going to play and he doesn't, you have to at least have another option to slide into your roster that may be starting a little bit later in the evening of that day. So if you right now are sitting on a player on your roster right now that you like, I just don't know if that guy's ever going to play for me, then what you need to think about doing is moving on right now, go into the waiver wire right now, and possibly looking for a player with a 6 o'clock, 6:30 or later start time in case Armstrong doesn't play. You have another option, an alternative later on in the day, so you don't get stuck not having a starter at quarterback. And then obviously that Wake offense has been tremendous. They're hosting NC State, and all of that Wake passing game right now is just deadly for college fantasy football. And I wouldn't want to be playing anybody that has Sam Hartman right now and A.T. Perry and Ja'Cory Roberson. So let's move on out of the ACC. Let's get into the Big 12, guys. Oklahoma playing at Baylor. That's a matchup that jumps out at me because I've been saying this all along. Oklahoma has not impressed me. I feel that Oklahoma could have lost 3, possibly 4 games up to this point. And now the Sooners are facing the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th best team on paper, according to the standings. As of right now in the Big 12, over the next 3 weeks, that's how they'll close the season. I think it's going to be a tough matchup for them. I wouldn't be surprised to see Baylor win this game, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Oklahoma eke it out as well. I think if you have Caleb Williams, a lot of what Oklahoma is going to do on offense is going to go through him. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about benching him. Is he a top 3 or 5 starter this week? That's debatable, but I do think that he's good enough that you get him in there, and there's too much potential in that Oklahoma offense to not start him against Baylor this week. But that's the one that's really got my attention because I do feel that somewhere over these next 3 weeks, the Sooners are going to get tripped up either against Baylor, Oklahoma State, or Iowa State. That's a tough run for them to go through. And if they do, hats off to them. They deserve it. And I'll then start giving them a little bit of a shout out. But I've got my concerns about the Sooners, and I'm worried that they're going to get tripped up in one of those games. Iowa State playing on the road at Texas Tech. Right now the Cyclones still have a shot at the Big 12 title, and that bodes well for a lot of you guys with Breece Hall, who continues to run up big numbers. Chandler Morris at TCU. There's 2 things that stick out in the 2 matchups that are remaining. Chandler Morris at TCU, for as well as he did last week, I don't think he's a start this week against Oklahoma State. Ride the wave of emotion and, Patterson leaving out there, team rallying. They upset Baylor 30-28. Chandler Morris, throws for 461 yards, 2 touchdowns, runs for 70 yards and a touchdown. I don't know if I see that happening at Oklahoma State. I think this could be a situation where if you start Chandler Morris, and I hope I'm wrong for his sake, because I'd like for you guys to really for you guys starting him this week to get something out of him. But it could be a situation where you're just chasing points, where he had a big week last week. You missed it. You picked him up. You start him because he had a big week last week, and then he kind of falls flat on his face because that Oklahoma State defense is pretty good. This isn't the week that I'd be looking to start Chandler Morris. I think really what you want is you want him to play well this week, and you really want him to shine in that matchup against Kansas next week. That's where you're holding Chandler Morris for, is that matchup against the Jayhawks. And then, transitioning into that matchup, the Jayhawks are playing at Texas this week. And, I know a lot of you guys holding on to Bijan Robinson right now, a little nervous about whether or not he will be available for that matchup. I know, he played last game and he was a little dinged up. Apparently there was some type of maybe neck strain that was involved for Bijan. And I have to tell you, I'd be really nervous if I had Bijan Robinson this week for two reasons. One, it is a neck strain. I don't think that, I don't know if it's really serious. I would think if this were a playoff game, for sure he'd be playing. But you have to remember this. Texas is playing at home. They're playing home against a 1-8 Kansas team that's not very good. I don't think they're going to need him. And so the question is, one, is he going to play? Two, if he does play, how long are they going to leave him out there when they really could probably just rest him up? They're going to probably beat Kansas and get by without Bijan. But curious to see how this one unfolds. I don't think they need him, but I wouldn't even be shocked to see him suit up. I wouldn't be shocked to see him play, but I wouldn't be shocked to see the Longhorns. And I could be wrong because remember, Kansas gave Oklahoma all they could handle. And I said, don't assume anything. Start your studs. And if Bijan Robinson is suited up and he's going through workouts with the ones in the pregame, I don't know how you don't start him. And if he happens not to play, it's just a case of bad luck. But I do think that there's at least an element of risk involved with Bijan Robinson this week. And I would be a little nervous about a goose egg if I did have to start him this week. So I think we really need to be, for me, he's the one player that sticks out more than any other this week where I'm really nervous for you guys and keeping my fingers crossed that he plays or we get at least clarity on whether or not he's going to play Saturday or not. Let's get into the Big 12. When I look at the matchups here, Michigan, Penn State, here's something that I mentioned way back in the beginning of the season with teams that have multiple running backs, situations where they had 3-4 deep. And I said, sometimes time works these situations out, whether it's an injury, whether it's a guy moving on from a transfer. And that's exactly what's playing out right now, I think, with Michigan, if Blake Corum is not available for this matchup at Penn State. An unfortunate turn of events will be the benefit for fantasy owners of Hassan Haskins. The only problem is that this isn't the greatest matchup for Blake Corum to not be available for you owners for Hassan Haskins because it's a road game against a good defense in Penn State. But if Haskins is going to get 85% of the carries this week with Corum out, I don't know how you keep him out of the roster, out of the lineup, out of your roster build this week. And so if Corum's out, that makes, where I was looking at a split backfield on the road at Penn State, where to tell you that you were going to probably have to weigh out your options. If Corum's not available, I think you have to get Haskins in there if he's going to carry and do the heavy lifting on the running game this week. The same philosophy applies over at Wisconsin, where Chez Melisi is a doubt to go this week. It seems like he's questionable. And if so, this may be the game of the year to have Braylon Allen for you guys that went into the waiver wire and picked him up. Braylon Allen could have a monster game this week at home against Northwestern. If Chez Melisi is out, he is definitely a must start. And I have to tell you, I don't think it looks, I'm pretty optimistic that Allen's going to get that start. And I have a feeling that Mulisi isn't going to play. He seems like he's very questionable. Like I said, I'm recording this Wednesday evening, so I've got to try to check the notes around, but keep an eye on that. I think Braylon Allen's going to be in a lot of starting roster builds going into the weekend. And I think there's potential to have a really big game this week. Iowa hosting Minnesota this week. This is going to be one of those, it seems like every week's a grind out game for Iowa. Speaking of split backfields, I don't know with Minnesota right now if this is the week you want to really take a risk with one of those backs, even though you might have Thomas or Irving. I don't think you want to risk it on the road against Iowa this week. So I'm not starting either of those guys. I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned it when Ohio State played Nebraska. I mentioned how Ohio State was, they went through Indiana, Maryland, Rutgers, and they look like gangbusters. And I said that I'm still not sold on Ohio State. We know that. Oregon went in there early this year. Tulsa scored some points on them as well. We saw Nebraska give them everything they could handle in Lincoln. I think Purdue could score some points. Now, I know Purdue's coming off that home upset win of Michigan State, so I think some of you guys may be a little too optimistic about Purdue. But against that Ohio State defense, I don't know if I'm sitting David Bell. And certainly with my season on the line and playoffs on the line, I'm definitely, if I'm going down, and I say this all the time, if I'm going down, all things considered equal between David Bell and another player on my roster, I'm going down with the guy that I invested an early pick in. I'm going down with the guy that has the highest ceiling, and I'm going down with David Bell this week. All things considered equal on your roster this week, and then Michigan State, hopefully a big game from Kenneth Walker this week as they host Maryland. So we come out of the Big Ten. Let's get into, and going conference by conference. I'm hoping not to skip over anyone this week. Let's go into the Pac-12, where Tavion Thomas has just been an absolute steamroller at the running back position for Utah. There's no doubt he's a must-start this week. That Stanford team does not look good. Hopefully, B.J. Baylor for you guys can get things back on track right there. Rachaad White was unstoppable last week against USC. I think this will be a tougher game for them on the road at Washington, but I think his playmaking ability is just a difference maker for that Arizona State offense. They're going to want to get him as many touches as they can. I do think that Deontay Trey Yanum will get a few more touches this week. Last week, he lost a fumble. He didn't see a touch after that. We'll see what a week of practice does and see if he gets a few more touches, because his touchdown ratio is pretty darn good when he does start. I think he's scored a touchdown in all but one game this year. So maybe White doesn't get the heavy workload that he got last week. But after what he did last week, man, if I'm that Arizona State coaching staff, I'm saying let's ride this guy out for the rest of the year. And I think if you have White, you have to feel really good right now. UCLA, look, a lot of you guys picked up Britton Brown, Zach Charbonnet at the beginning of the year. They've been an absolute roller coaster of a ride. DTR just doesn't seem to stay healthy. It's going to be a little bit of a hit or miss. It's a great matchup for UCLA. I don't know how you have Britton Brown or Zach Charbonnet this week and really sit those guys unless you have some star power on your bench that you can get in there. But I think those two guys are definitely worth a look this week when the Bruins host Colorado. And then the late game in the Pac-12, Washington State at Oregon. I think for me, of all the games, for you guys that like to gamble a little bit, this 14 points, line jumps out at me. And I think Washington State's a little bit better than I think some people give them credit for. And I'm not quite sure that Oregon is as good as some people are giving them credit for. I think this is a game where Washington State may be able to put a scare into Oregon. I don't think they can beat them, but I think this is a game Washington State could keep close. I'm interested to see how this plays out, but Travis Dye has been an absolute monster. And he's between Travis Dye and Tavion Thomas in the Pac-12, those two guys are really just crushing it late. And Rachaad White last week, a lot of you guys crushing it late in the night. So, there's probably a lot of fantasy owners over the last couple of weeks that have gone to bed up by a boatload of points that were playing Tavion Thomas, maybe playing Rachaad White, maybe playing Travis Dye, and just got absolutely housed when they woke up in the morning and saw, the points that those guys are putting up. So let's jump over, and we're going to end up with the SEC guys. And this is the time of the year where a lot of people start making fun of the SEC because of their scheduling. Really, for us college fantasy football guys, this is where you kind of have to have, you've got to have foresight at week 9, week 10, and know that these weeks are coming, right? You've got Florida with a matchup against Samford. So if you've been struggling to find a defense special teams all year long and you were playing for this week, you probably dipped in and got Florida off the waiver wire a couple of weeks early. Alabama hosting New Mexico State. I mean, you can't feel good if you're playing teams that have these defenses this week, right? And then, Missouri had that, they ran into a roadblock at Georgia. They finally get that home matchup for South Carolina. I mentioned last week was the week you did not want to own Tyler Beatty. So now you get more of a regular matchup for him. So I think he gets back to his ways. Curious to see what happens with Tennessee. Looks like Georgia's toughest matchup here between now and the SEC championship. Curious to see how they take the Vols. And I'm curious just to see what that defense can do on the road at Tennessee. I think this would be a really good test for Georgia. I think Tennessee could maybe put a scare in them for a half. We'll see how that plays out. Or maybe if Tennessee can score points and force Georgia's offense to put up a few points. And this game really doesn't bother me. If I'm a Georgia fan, I actually just think that the Bulldogs are that much better than everyone else. But if there is one game that I'd be concerned about on the schedule this year, this might be it. Just in case of a letdown here. When I look at the rest of the schedule I think the one that jumps out at me is Texas A&M, Ole Miss, just because the Ole Miss offense has been beaten up for a couple of weeks. I'm curious to see how Corral shakes up in the projections. I can almost guarantee you he's not going to be in the top 5, 7. I'd be shocked if he's even in the top 10. He does get a home matchup, which is great. But the Texas A&M defense has been really solid. Last week, that Texas A&M Auburn matchup was basically a battle of the defenses, and it was defense that decided it when Bo Nix decided to put one on the ground, and Texas A&M housed that, and that was pretty much the difference of the game right there, and really kind of put the space between that. And then, over at, the LSU Arkansas matchup, the only thing I'll say with that is be careful with LSU quarterbacks, because it looks like Nussmeier and Johnson will get a go. And so, you're going to be playing some quarterback roulette right there. One thing I didn't cover, let's go into the independents, because I didn't cover that, even though I did cover them for most of the conferences, but I didn't talk about Army Bucknell, another one of those great defensive matchups. And so that's why I want to bring up that one. UMass host in Maine. I want to bring that up because Ellis Merriweather has been an absolute workhorse for the Minutemen, and I think this is another good matchup for him this week. And so those are the two games when I was doing the conferences that I didn't get a chance to really get into. And so I think that's going to do it for all the conferences, guys. That's going to do it for a week 11. We're here. It's playoff time. Money weeks is what I like to call them. Mike and I are going to get as much stuff, much content as we can up on the site this week. It looks like I think he's doing the Friday, Saturday main and Saturday late. You could expect the DFS write-ups for those. We just won't have the Thursday showdown. And, it's full go, full throttle here. Once when we hit those double-digit weeks, the light at the end of the tunnel is here. Playoff time is here. There's a lot on the line for you guys. Get those emails in. I try to, I mention to you guys all the time, get the emails in, get the questions in. It's easier to find me on Discord if you DM me than if you mention me in there, because I get alerts on everything that gets posted in there. And sometimes those alerts get a little lost and I've got to thumb through 100 messages to get to it. Hit me up through the DM on Discord or send me in the email. And if you're going to do that, try to get those questions in on Thursday. Try to get them in on Friday. You wait to send those questions in on a Saturday morning, you're taking a chance that I'm just not going to have enough time, and Mike's not going to have enough time to get a well thought out response for you to give you the answers that you're looking for. We're trying to help you guys, give you the insight, all that we can to help you through these matchups this week. Like I said, we don't have the crystal ball, or we're gonna swing and miss as many times as we swing and hit. All we're trying to do is give you the insight that we have from our experiences and from what we see week to week to help you make the decisions that you feel comfortable with going into starting lineups this weekend. That's it, guys. Week 11 is here. The money weeks are upon us, and keep me posted on what's going on. And when I talk to you guys next week, every league that pretty much is going on is going to be in some sort of a playoff format, because all you guys are here. And the time is now. So good luck to everyone that's looking to qualify for a playoff spot. Good luck to everyone that's playing this week. Get the questions in. We'll see you guys in next week, guys. See you in week 12.